I made sure that they changed the policy in the state of California so that every transgender inmate in the prison system would have access to the medical care that they desired and need. And I believe it was not only, I know it was historic in California, but I believe actually it may have been one of the first, if not the first in the country, where I pushed for that policy in a Department of Corrections.
It's really hard to imagine that was the political movement that was calling us weird in the 2024 election. That was Kamala Harris in 2019 taking a victory lap after making sure the California Department of Corrections provided gender-altering surgery for an inmate paid for by the taxpayer. We are obviously breathing a sigh of relief because she lost in that endeavor, but the policy she was pushing has taken on a life of its own, and it doesn't just stop in California. In September of 2024, a federal judge, Richard Young, ruled that a male Indiana inmate who strangled his 11-month-old stepdaughter to death has the right to a taxpayer-funded surgery to turn him into a woman? It's almost as absurd as like if he claimed he was a Muslim woman now. Actually, that is what he ended up claiming. Needless to say, it sparked outrage nationwide. President Trump signed an executive order banning this exact practice earlier this year. And right on cue, the ACLU sued the Trump administration over this order, but the cavalry is arriving. Indiana Attorney General Todd Rokita is co-leading a 24-state amicus brief supporting President Trump's executive order to make sure taxpayer cash isn't used to fund vanity projects for violent criminals in prison. Joining us now, Indiana State Attorney General Todd Rokita. General Rokita, tell us about this effort that you are co-leading to support President Trump's executive orders and disallow men from entering women's prisons.
Well, hey, Matt, great to be with you again. It's been a while, but you've been a great friend of myself personally and of America. And thanks for standing with President Trump and the rest of us to save this country. I got to tell you, President Trump and just what he's done in just a little over a month or so has just been amazing. And no, I'm not tired of winning at all as an American, and certainly not as an attorney general. So we do get together with like-minded attorneys general, and we lead and we help the president wherever we can. Now, a couple of ways that we're helping him. First, this amicus brief, if you don't mind, on Tren de Aragua, right? This idea that one district judge in DC can be ran to by the liberal media and mob and activists and everyone else and get a nationwide injunction is absolutely ridiculous for something that is completely within the president's purview. So we lead on that effort to get that overturned and try to put a stop or stem in this idea that one district judge can bind a whole nation like that. So there's that. And then helping the president on everything from keeping men out of women's sports to keeping men out of women's prisons to what we're doing here in Indiana, stopping the taxpayers, Matt, but get this, from having to pay for transgender surgeries for these prisoners just because they wake up one day bored in prison, had nothing to do but read legal briefs and decide they want to change their sex just to create chaos in the system and cause outlandish expense to taxpayers. So Indiana has got to win that case, but we're aligned with the president on all these things.
It is odd that the ACLU is who you are matched against in this legal contest. They seem to want this biological male in women's prisons. I never would have thought that the ACLU would be attacking prisons as a female-only space. As the lead law enforcement officer for Indiana, are you concerned for safety of women in the women's prisons if men are allowed to wake up and go there?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate your question too. And I guess the result of it would be technically a man, although transgender now in a woman's prison. And that certainly is a problem. And it's the Republican Party, it's the conservatives, it's the people who love this country that are also standing up for women, and it's the left that's denigrating women. And that would be the case if Indiana does not win this case against this prisoner who wants the taxpayers to pay for his sex change surgery. Okay? So he can go now presumably into a woman's prison. I happen to think that the reasons behind this and behind the ACLU, Matt, defending him are a lot more sinister. I think it's a way to create chaos in the system. It's a way to create expense for the system. Think about it this way. In one of our Indiana prisons alone, 30% of the inmates now identify as a person of the opposite sex. Now, that's not how it was before, but they're looking for a way, again, to game the system to create chaos. And so that's what's going to happen here if Indiana loses this. And we have a judge, I think, appointed by Clinton originally, who's agreed with the prisoner and said this is cruel and unusual punishment not to give the prisoner his sex change surgery, which is absolutely ridiculous. You know, it's
what you just said is hard to believe, General. What you just said is hard to believe, that 30% of the inmate population claims they're a different gender than the gender that they were born.
Yeah.
Are those all or predominantly men saying that they're now women, or are there women trying to get into men's prisons too?
No, it's predominantly men, and so you can see my point. That's way far and above the 0.01% or whatever that the left, whatever small percentage that the left likes to give out and say, why are you picking on these people? Yeah, 30% of Indiana's inmates now say they identify with the opposite sex, and that's mostly male identifying as female. You know, the fact of the matter is they're doing time. They got a lot of time on their hands. They read. They're all jailhouse lawyers. So if Indiana loses this case, it's going to mean a floodgate of lawsuits and taxpayers paying for these transgender surgeries, not just in Indiana, but probably nationwide. So our General Assembly, our legislature, rightly put on the books a law a couple of years ago at my behest, actually, when I came in as Attorney General, because it wasn't against the law before, to ban these transgender surgeries for our inmates so that the taxpayers wouldn't be on the hook. And that's what's being litigated now. And this judge has said, oh, that's cruel and unusual punishment, which is absolutely ridiculous. There are things that are cruel and unusual punishment in our history. And I don't have to go into all those examples. This is not one of them. No one is owed a transgender surgery in order to be safe from cruel and unusual punishment.
That is so obvious. I can't even believe we have to say that with a straight face, that it is not cruel and unusual if you were born a man to remain a man. I would have never thought about it otherwise. I do want to get your perspective on what feels like a judicial coup that we're enduring in the United States. And you've taken it upon yourself to work with other state attorneys general and file these amicus briefs and make the legal intellectual argument for the powers that President Trump is rightfully administering. But I wonder what role you see among the state attorneys general to really battle the tyranny of one judge in one district trying to conduct U.S. foreign policy or immigration policy. Do you think that state attorneys general will actually have to start bringing original actions to ripen these questions before more favorable jurists on the bench?
Yeah, it might come to that. But the pressure of the states is nothing to be underestimated. We showed that in the last 4 years. We were the last line of defense against the crazy that is otherwise known as the Biden administration. And so you're going to see us continue to play a role now with an administration that is full of common sense and courage, frankly. I want to be clear on this Tren de Aragua, and what we're talking about here with the touchstone of all this was this judge in D.C. who I believe was part of the FISA court at the time that perpetuated dossiers or allowed dossiers against people like President Trump. So he's pretty dyed in the wool against the president, and now has several of these presidential cases, even though they're supposed to be assigned randomly or anonymously. That aside, he's not the first judge to do nationwide injunctions erroneously. This is one unelected judge over one district, particularly the District of DC, has a plaintiff before him that's not even from the district, really. That promulgated a nationwide injunction. So whatever state you're in, this judge now controls the situation, so he thinks. That is not what our founders intended. That is not what the Constitution states. That is, in my opinion, an abuse. And to your question, it's an abuse of our state sovereignty here in Indiana to have a judge in D.C. decide things like this. So you betcha attorneys general are going to be fighting against this on all sorts of issues. Now, this particular issue, Matt, real quick, this plane getting turned around, which was his demand, is really an absolutely unneeded and ridiculous demand to begin with. We can't forget that, let's say, they still have due process rights in the sense that if these murderers, thugs, gang members think that they're not getting due process or that their asylum appeal is being wrongly decided, they still have access to our courts. They just have to do it from Venezuela. And that's the bugaboo with the left. They don't want these criminals deported at all because it sets a dangerous narrative and precedent that we could start deporting other criminals like those who cross the border illegally. That is a crime. It may be a misdemeanor for the first time. It's a crime the second time or third time you do it, which is a lot of our illegal immigration these days. So they don't want to set that precedent, but that's the fact. They could still have their rights if they think they're wrongly deported. They just have to argue it from Venezuela.
The greatest threat to the Trump agenda is the tyranny of a singular district court judge somewhere in America blocking the policies. And one of the key tools that President Trump has at his disposal is a tremendous, talented class of Republican state attorneys general. Todd Rokita would be at the top of that list as far as intellect and just doggedness to get the job done. General Rokita, thank you so much, and we're glad you're on the case and fighting for the good folks in Indiana.
Thank you, Matt. Great to be with you again. Great to see you, my friend.